We going? Okay. In 2001, an insurgent group who had been active in the area began an overt operation in Afghanistan. Within 2 years, according to a database published by Dr. Mark Harold from the University of New Hampshire, there had been more than 3,000 civilian deaths as direct results of bombings from this organization. If this headline was aired, there would be outrage against whatever group had done this. But when the group is identified not as insurgents, but as our own military, most people interpret these deaths as just necessary collateral for justified goals. In reality, though, the U.S.'s presence in the Middle East has very much the same goals as the insurgent groups that they are fighting within the area. And other than our Western values, it's hard to demarcate the two antagonizing groups except for their affiliations. Insurgency, as it's presented in the media, is often with the implication that the rebel group's cause is patently illegitimate. But the continued presence of any advanced level of insurgency brings into question the established power's legitimacy as a governance. Because insurgency can only arbitrarily be separated from the people in the area, and is actually an extreme illustration of the represented population's values. In a conflict like this, the main goal of each contender is to establish legitimacy in the eyes of the populace. Insurgent groups are not secretive and conspiratorial groups, but represent a sizable interest of the population that they are a part of. Any protracted conflict with an insurgency is evidence to the amount of legitimacy that they hold within their population. Resistance is not simply a matter of a small outlier group refusing to cooperate with the state's agenda. Resistance comes from a consequence of the state failing to meet the needs of the population. And the specific violent incidents are merely the extremes that stand out from popular resistance. Insurgency represents the grievances of the population through violent tactics. This is because the presence of counterinsurgency also uses violent tactics, and the state's legitimacy itself is built upon the threat of violence. In our culture, we have an instilled reverence for nonviolent resistance and a distaste for violence as a method of change. Because of that, violent insurgencies are easily delegitimized in our media by focusing on their violent tactics and not the reasons for the attacks. The real threat must be understood as extending beyond the insurgents themselves, the militants, radicals, and subversives. The threat actually includes primarily the population that they appeal to, the grievances that they seek to address, and the social conditions that create those problems. By our implicit delegitimization of insurgency, there is an attempt to delegitimize the grievances that the insurgency represents, and there's an attempt to delegitimize the grievances that the insurgency, as a representative of the general culture, is presenting via their violent tactics. When the grievances of the represented population are overlooked or presented as meaningless to our population, it reinforces our culture's belief that our military's goals are more valid. This is a natural goal of our government because counterinsurgency's goal is not militarily removing an insurgent group, but about reclaiming and maintaining the state's authority. Violence and territory control are part of this project, but it is really legitimacy or the consent of the governed that separates the winners from the losers in these conflicts. War by other means, a report published by the RAND Corporation, which is a global policy think tank developed by the US military, distills the goals of both insurgency and counterinsurgency as not to monopolize force, but to monopolize legitimate force. Military aspects of counterinsurgency are necessary, but so are the softer, subtler efforts to bolster public support for the government. Both are understood as elements of political power. Thus, the counterinsurgency tries to understand not just the insurgent group, but the rest of the population with whom they target their info operations to move their center of gravity toward the desired end state of the military's strategy. In most of the United States international affairs, the aggressor or occupying group has two distinct populations to defend their legitimacy to. Not only are they fighting to establish legitimacy to the people in the occupied territory, but they must also maintain legitimacy within our country. A conundrum appears when the balance between legitimacy and violence is undermined by tactics that, in an attempt to defend legitimacy, end up undermining themselves. The longer a conflict continues, the more this irony builds, and the legitimacy of the state becomes more damaged in the eyes of both populations. Revolutions go through 3 stages: proto-insurgency, small-scale insurgency, and major insurgency. Proto-insurgency is small and vulnerable and generally incapable of widespread or large-scale violence. Most of these are not even noticed and are just written off as small groups of criminals or crackpots. But the goals of counterinsurgency at this point are to understand this group and see how related its grievances are to popular ideas. The response is primarily just an attempt to improve the public's perception of government, which limits the insurgency's support from growing. A small-scale insurgency begins developing when the proto-insurgency gains members outside of its initial cadre or formative group. At this point, the actions of the insurgency become more daring in an attempt to demonstrate capabilities and be taken seriously by the population. Government response to this is to redouble their attempt to shape political and economic conditions to disincentivize popular support for the insurgency. At both of these levels, violent government response is limited to police forces. A major insurgency occurs when the state begins responding with violent force by the state's regular military units. All levels of opposition to the state available to the state are used to return the insurgency to the lowest possible level at this point. If an insurgency fails to collapse after this intensification of state response, it is because the grievances aired by the insurgency are closely aligned with popular support. And this gives the insurgent cause legitimacy, and entails serious questions about the legitimacy assumed by the state, especially as the conflict becomes protracted. When insurgency is covered by American media, it is often colored by our government's attempt to maintain its legitimacy to its citizens. But if we are going to meaningfully attempt to have an objective analysis of a revolution, we cannot begin with the assumption that the goals of the insurgency group are patently illegitimate. The longer a resistance holds out, the more legitimate their cause, because in order to continue, there must be substantial overlap with the values of the local population, which demonstrates the relevance of their existence as representative of the values of the area.